A trailer was just released for a movie coming spring next year about a modern American civil war.
19 states have seceded.
The United States Army ramps up activity.
The White House issued warnings to the Western forces as well as the Florida Alliance.
The three-term president assures the uprising will be dealt with swiftly.
Let me know if you want to try anything on.
Are you guys aware there's like a pretty huge civil war going on all across America?
We just try to stay out. With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
It's caused quite a bit of a stir amongst various commentators online. And since I've talked about the looming dangers of such an event a few times recently on this channel, I thought it would be worth commenting on this trailer. There are reasons to think that the trailer might be the sign of a well-done and important movie that gains significance beyond its fictional status. There is, however, one scenario where it could hurt a great deal more than it helps. Well, sounds interesting. Let's discuss.
Mr. President, do you regret the use of airstrikes against American citizens?
There are certain moments when we are at a particular point in history when a movie comes along to act as something of a warning about the consequences that we might be stumbling into, and it makes a bit of an impact. So it happened when the world was in the depths of a Cold War, bristling with nuclear weapons on both sides at the behest of an increasingly itchy trigger finger. In the UK, we had a movie called Threads, which showed one identifiable city being blown apart as part of a nationwide nuclear strike. And the dark consequences that followed for the nation and for the survivors. In the US, it was the movie The Day After. Both brought home the real-life consequences that would follow from an all-out nuclear exchange, although the American version ended up adding a disclaimer at the end saying that actually the reality would be a lot worse than even that shown in the film. They didn't change policies, but they did land heavily with audiences and the public consciousness. They became defining moments of the time, as a stark choice was being processed in the minds of decision-makers and citizens alike. Then, for climate change, there was the American movie The Day After Tomorrow, a movie that played some of the same role as the ones I just mentioned, rather undermined, you might suggest, by its relative scientific illiteracy. Trying to make a short-term disaster movie over a long-term process of gradual change led for them to take significant liberties with what the science tells us to actually expect. That made it an unhelpful contribution, but it nevertheless caught attention and made some sort of an impact. Now we have this one. America ponders what it would look like if it were to indulge itself in another civil war.
Citizens of America.
The so-called Western forces of Texas and California
Have suffered a very great defeat at the hands of the United States military.
If you'd made this film 20 years ago, people would have thought it was an entertaining enough fantasy, no different to any number of future dystopian scenarios that they see in the movies. But this time certainly seemed to be touching a nerve, because yes, people look at the premise and they say that this is an abyss that they are currently indeed staring right into.
Forces will reach the White House on July 4th.
Oh my God.
Get in the car! Get in the car! Move, move, move!
Here's what we know from the trailer. There is apparently a dictator in the White House. There's a reference to this being the third term of this president. There is a reference to
They shoot journalists on sight in the Capitol.
I've seen people mocking the fact that part of the alliance of states lined up against the federal government in this movie is California and Texas. How ridiculous, those people say. The people who made this movie must be idiots if they think those states would ever end up on the same side. I think they're missing the point. And it's the point that makes me relatively optimistic that this might actually be a well-done movie. It's easy to see why a number of those, particularly on the Trump-supporting right, would be highly sceptical and suspicious of the idea of a movie made by Hollywood about civil war. The assumption would be, and not without some justification, that left-wing lovies would be envisaging the Civil War as a thinly veiled Trump attack vehicle, the rogue president would bear an uncanny resemblance to you-know-who, the factions would fit all the groups we see today, with the ones on the left made to be heroic, standing against the dumb and pitiful forces on the other side, or the brutal forces on the other side, whatever. And the message of a movie would be partisan and delivered with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the brain. Now, all we've seen is a trailer. Trailers are not the movie. And that may well turn out to be the movie that we actually get. But from the trailer, it seems to me that we have something attempting to be more interesting and nuanced than that. And the first sign of that is the alliance between California and Texas.
The so-called Western forces of Texas and California.
This is not intended to represent the factions as they exist today. By making it clear that this is not about today's politics, it's about the principle of the consequences of what could happen if civil war became a reality, it frees up people on both sides to engage with it on its face, without necessarily taking it as an attack on their side. If a president is defined by actions that go beyond what we've seen in reality, so a third term, for instance, presumably forced, everyone in principle, removed from the emotional ties and all the messy justifications of real life, everyone in principle would be able to see that and agree that those actions are bad. Yes, reality is more complex because of tribal affiliation. It's a basic truth that people can, in principle and in theory, describe a certain action as bad or unconstitutional, while then finding excuses and reasons to support it in reality if it's their side that ends up doing it. We see this in practice all the time. Left-wing identity politics activists who obsess about the need for safe spaces, justifying an act of actual genocide against Jewish civilians, for instance. What, you want one on the other side? Fine. A few years back, Christian conservatives brushing over Trump's rather well-publicised infidelities and coarse bragging about exploiting his celebrity to get sex. Just two examples amongst many where people of apparently strong convictions show just how flexible those convictions can be when it's one of their own. All the more reason why movies highlighting consequences can be so important if they take you out of those short-term fudges and bring the bigger picture into view. But all right, this movie, at least from what we can tell from the trailer, is trying to present us with a scenario removed from current tribal loyalties. And it does so apparently with a particular focus.
There's some kind of misunderstanding here. What? Well, you're American, okay?
Okay. What kind of American are you? You don't know?
And this is the point. The common ground between Americans does not hold. But we're Americans, yes, but what kind of Americans? If a movie is about the assault on the things that Americans hold in common by the divisiveness of civil war, and the resolution of a movie perhaps is how that insistence on refusing to be so divided and to reclaim that common identity it could be immensely powerful and importantly telling in this time. Now, the political activists won't take the message, but they remain the minority. Yes, a highly visible minority, a very loud minority, but still a minority. That's my hope for this movie. Previous movies made by this crew have been good. Movies like Ex Machina, for instance, films that are interested in exploring dilemmas and ideas and grey areas in a very intelligent way. And that is what this area desperately needs. And then I'm going to spoil all of that with a rather important but. I think the nuanced movie that I would make would have two sides not directly recognisable in modern context, yes, but you'd also have both sides making mistakes. You'd have a presidency where they drifted without being cartoon-level villains. The theme becomes the need to avoid the mistakes that we ourselves could make, that we should recognise the signs and value instead what unites us above what divides us. The trailer includes the line, "All empires must fall," which is historically true, and civil war would be an entirely predictable and feasible way for that to happen to the US. It is a cautionary tale. On that basis, like the nuclear wars movies, it will have the most power, you might suggest, if it ends bleakly. However, this trailer is compatible with a different story. And, this is still Hollywood, even if it's the better part, whatever that means. And can Hollywood really do that bleak? So this other story is one where the presidency is unambiguously bad, and everyone watching the movie, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, are meant to line themselves up in their minds with the rebellion, which is seeking to overthrow those who have shredded constitutional rule. After all, both Texas and California are on that side, so whichever you associate with in real life, there is a route to envisaging yourself as being on that side in this movie. So the easy, and in my view dangerous dynamic, could simply be President and the executive team goes unambiguously rogue, the forces of sanity and goodness fight back, and in the third act they storm the White House and remove him from power in order to re-establish the Union in its former glory. And the brief scene we see of the troopers coming into the White House makes me wonder whether that is going to be the end. That, in my view, will not just be a lame movie, although it will be, but also a potentially disastrous one. Remember, in real life, both sides assume that they are right. Both sides think the other side is the more likely to do unconstitutional rogue things. And both sides seem utterly incapable of a degree of empathy that would allow them to understand how the other side sees the world. What America probably does not need, as it stares into the abyss, is the message that if you think the current incumbent has crossed the line, then it is good and it is inevitable that people will fight back. You might end up creating a movie that inadvertently provides a rallying cry rather than a cautionary tale. In 2024, you may have Trump re-elected, with the other side believing that he is the dictator foretold by the movie. In 2024, you might end up with Biden re-elected, either because Trump was prevented from standing by legal maneuvers, very topical this week, or because he lost but very closely and the validity of that election is inevitably disputed. These are right now the most likely scenarios. A close disputed election with two sides who just can't put up with the idea of the other side winning. Let's be clear, that bit of a movie with the awkward moment.
What kind of American are you?
Let's not pretend we're not already embracing that moment. Right now you have stories of all sorts of conservatives moving out of places like California to move to Florida or Texas. You have Democrats moving in the other direction. That is how it starts. Now, it may not be as far advanced as to make it irreversible, but people sorting themselves geographically into states that are increasingly made up of their kind of American. That isn't what you want to see. And it's far enough advanced that the awfulness of that movie moment is already blunted because it's about 5 years behind the reality. So there it is, anyway, my take on what could turn out to be a defining movie in 2024. Now, maybe it will just turn out to be just a movie. Maybe it will be so bad it will fade from view as a moment that could have been. But we have seen before movies that define and galvanise their time. If this is one of them, that's kind of bad news for all of those Americans who were like that shop owner, desperately trying to ignore all that political stuff.
We just try to stay out. With what we see on the news, seems like it's for the best.
So anyway, what's your take from what you've seen? Let me know in the comments below.